In this lesson, we're going to go over the traditional elements of the intentional torts of trespass to chattels and conversion. Here, we say the intentional torts of trespass to chattels and conversion occur when the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property. With conversion, we have the additional requirement that the interference is so serious that the defendant may justifiably be required to pay the plaintiff the full value of the personal property. And with trespass to chattels and conversion, we see that the defendant must have acted with the intent to damage or possess personal property that is in fact properly possessed by another. So we're going to break each of these elements down in a lot of detail, but there's a couple big picture concepts we need to nail down. First, number one, it is important to recognize that trespass to chattels and conversion are two separate, distinct, intentional torts. The only reason we're discussing them together is because there's a ton of overlap between these two intentional torts, but they are separate and distinct. What we'll see here is if the elements in black, elements 1, 2, and 3 are satisfied, then we say the defendant is liable for the intentional tort of trespass to chattels. If the additional requirement we have in blue, element 2B, is also satisfied on top of elements 1, 2, and 3, then we say the defendant is liable for both trespass to chattels and conversion. Okay, but the black elements, elements 1, 2, and 3, really remain the same for both of these intentional torts. For trespass to chattels and conversion, the analysis with elements 1, 2, and 3 is basically the same. The only difference we get to is with conversion, we have one additional requirement labeled in blue, this element 2B. Okay? That's kind of big picture point to make number one, and we're going to break all of that down in a ton of detail as we go through this. I think what'll be best is kind of to go through just these elements for trespass to chattels first, go over elements 1, 2, 3, get those down. Once we have that, then we can move on to conversion and kind of what this additional requirement looks like. Okay, but we'll break all of that down in a ton of detail as we work through this. The other note to make before we just start jumping into the elements, it's the same introductory note we've made in all of our lessons on intentional torts. Back to battery, assault, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, trespass to land. Remember, we said that with all of these intentional torts, and what's going to be the same for trespass to chattels and conversion, all of these intentional torts share the same prima facie essential elements. Remember, we need a voluntary act by the defendant, we need intent, and we need causation. Remember, we said that those three prima facie essential elements are baked into the elements of each intentional tort we discuss. And that's true for battery, assault, false imprisonment, IIED, trespass to land. We saw with all of those intentional torts, we needed a voluntary act by the defendant, intent, and causation. It's the same case for trespass to chattels and conversion. We'll see element number 1. We start with causation, then we'll move into the voluntary act requirements, and our last element is the intent requirement. So the good news is a lot of the analyses are going to look kind of similar to analyses we've talked about in previous lessons. It's because all of these intentional torts share the same prima facie essential elements. With that though, we can just jump right into this and start getting into the elements, starting with our causation element first. Here we say the intentional torts of trespass to chattels and conversion occur when the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property. Okay, so step 1, we always want to make sure that the defendant is the legal cause of the plaintiff's harm. And here, the plaintiff's harm is the interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. So with both trespass to chattels and conversion, step 1, we want to make sure that the defendant is the legal cause of the interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. And remember, the rule here is the defendant only has to be a substantial factor in bringing about the interference. Remember, we said there could always be multiple factors contributing to whatever the plaintiff's harm ultimately is. And our test, for purposes of intentional torts, is that the defendant only needs to be a substantial factor. It's not that the defendant needs to be the only factor. It's not that the defendant has to be the one and only factor. It's that the defendant is a substantial factor in bringing about whatever the harm is that the plaintiff is sustaining. With trespass to chattels and conversion, the harm we're dealing with is the interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. So step one, we always want to make sure that the defendant is the legal cause of that interference, and there we just have to make sure the defendant is a substantial factor in bringing about that interference. If so, that's enough to satisfy the causation element. Important to note here that with trespass to chattels and conversion, similar to our other intentional torts, it's pretty rare that causation would be an issue. Again, typically we see causation as an issue more so tested when we get to negligence. So when we get to negligence, we're going to see more causation issues. But here in intentional torts, we don't see as much with causation, and that'll become clear as we start to work through examples of what trespass to chattels and conversion kind of typically looks like. We'll see why causation really isn't usually an issue with these intentional torts. But again, it is important to make sure, step number one, that we verify the defendant actually is the legal cause of the interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property, which just means we need to make sure that the defendant was a substantial factor in bringing about this interference. But with that, we can actually start to define, okay, what is this interference we're talking about? What is this second element? What do we mean by an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property? I think step one, the best thing to kind of understand off the top, is with trespass to chattels and conversion, we're talking about personal property. We're not talking about land. We're not talking about real estate. We're not talking about anything that's attached to or affixed to land and real property. Here we're talking about personal property. So if we see interferences with the right of possession in land, in real property, in anything that's attached to land or real property, what is that? What intentional tort are we talking about? That would be trespass to land. Remember back to our last lesson, we talked about trespass to land and nuisance. So if we see an interference with the plaintiff's right to possess his land or the plaintiff's right to use and enjoy his land, that takes us back to trespass to land, not trespass to chattels, or it could potentially even be nuisance. All of that we discussed in our last lesson. So we want to make sure, number one, we are dealing with personal property, which is usually, items, objects that are movable. Typically, what we're going to classically see in these fact patterns are like valuable items that are objects that are movable. It'll be like, somebody's jewelry. It'll be someone's like fine antique. It'll be somebody's car. We're typically dealing with these types of tangible objects that are movable. And in, torts fact patterns, it's often things that are kind of like valuable, like a car, like an antique, like, jewelry. These types of objects are typically kind of what we're seeing tested as personal property in trespass to chattels and conversion fact patterns. But really anything that's movable, like a movable object, could be personal property for purposes of trespass to chattels and conversion. Basically, if it's not land, real estate, or something attached to land or real estate, it's probably personal property. Okay, so we understand what personal property is. We understand we're not talking about trespass to land. We're talking about trespass to chattels, which is about personal property, not land. The next thing is, what is this interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property? I've found that the best way to think about this, if I'm looking at a torts fact pattern and I'm wondering to myself, could we hold this defendant liable for trespass to chattels or conversion? Step number one I always ask myself is, does our plaintiff have actual damages? Actual damages are required. To find that we have an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property, step one, we need to make sure that our plaintiff actually has actual compensable damages. And in tort law, when we talk about actual damages, we're really meaning compensatory damages. Basically, the way it works in tort law is the plaintiff has some sort of loss. The plaintiff sustains a loss and wants to be compensated for that loss. Damages that compensate the plaintiff for a loss that he has sustained are what we call actual damages. So a lot of times in trespass to chattels and conversion, it's really easy to see the actual damages. If we have harm to the plaintiff's personal property or even harm to the plaintiff himself, the actual damages will be easy to see. If the defendant does anything that impairs the condition, the value, or the quality of the plaintiff's personal property, it's going to be easy to identify the actual damages. For example, if our defendant goes and takes a baseball bat and goes up to the plaintiff's car and smashes the plaintiff's car's windshield and the windshield shatters, and say it costs $500 to replace the windshield in the condition it was before it got smashed with a baseball bat. In that case, the actual damages are very easy to see. It's $500, right? That's the actual loss that our plaintiff sustained that he wants to be compensated for. He needs to replace the windshield on his car. Easy to see the actual damages. So if we have a fact pattern where there's actual harm to the plaintiff's personal property, like his car gets smashed with a baseball bat, that will be easy to identify the actual damages. Again, defendant doing anything that impairs the value, quality, or condition of the plaintiff's personal property. Of course, also, if our plaintiff sustains bodily harm, physical injury, say that the defendant steals the plaintiff's medicine, and this medicine's really important to the plaintiff. It's life-saving medicine. And our defendant steals that medicine. We'll say, as a direct result of not having access to the medicine, our plaintiff has some sort of physical injury and has to go to the hospital. In that case, it's going to be easy to see the actual damages, the loss that the plaintiff has sustained that he wants to be compensated for. He's got physical injury, he's going to the hospital. We can see the actual damages. So in some cases, it's easy to identify the interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property. Remember, step one, we have to ask, do we have actual damages? And in those cases where we have a harm to the personal property itself or a harm to the plaintiff, it'll be easy to see the actual damages. Where this gets more nuanced are the ideas of dispossession and loss of use. So another way that our plaintiff can show actual damages, which is required to show an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property, is this idea of dispossession. We say dispossession occurs when the defendant totally dispossesses the plaintiff of his personal property as by stealing or otherwise wrongfully asserting dominion and control over the personal property. So basically, when I say the word dispossession or dispossessing, you should just think of the word stealing. Typically, when we use the word dispossession in the context of trespass to chattels and conversion, we're talking about the defendant stealing personal property from the plaintiff. And there's a lot of ways we know a defendant can steal personal property from a plaintiff. There's a lot of manners in which this can be accomplished. Of course, the defendant could steal the personal property of another by force, by threat of force, by trickery, by deceit, by trespass, just taking it when the plaintiff isn't looking. There's a lot of ways a person can go about stealing property from another person. And in any of those cases, we would call that dispossession. Dispossession occurs when the defendant totally dispossesses the plaintiff of his personal property by stealing or otherwise wrongfully asserting dominion and control over the plaintiff's personal property. So, if we see that the plaintiff has had the total dispossession of his personal property take place, we should just automatically, in our heads, tick the box, oh, that's actual damages. Basically, if we see the interference amounting to dispossession, where the defendant's stealing the property, the plaintiff's loss of possession is going to amount to actual damages. Basically, that is just what the courts and law is going to say is that's just such a serious type of deprivation of personal property, where someone goes out wrongfully and steals property from another. That's such a serious, kind of aggravated type of deprivation of personal property that itself is a harm that the plaintiff experiences. And that in of itself is actual damages. So basically, if we're looking at a fact pattern and we see that the defendant is wrongfully stealing property from the plaintiff, that is actual damages. That will always satisfy our second element. That is an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. That's total deprivation. That's total dispossession. That's so wrong, so serious, it's automatically actual damages, which means it's an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. Okay? It does not matter if the property is ultimately returned to the plaintiff in the same condition that the plaintiff lost it in. So if our defendant goes and steals personal property from the plaintiff and is caught instantly by the police, like gets outside the door, runs 1 block away, and is tackled by a police officer, and the personal property is like instantly returned to the plaintiff. In that case, some people may wonder, well, what are the actual damages that the plaintiff has sustained here? You know, he only lost his property for like a couple minutes, and it's returned to him in the same condition he lost it in. So what are his actual damages? Again, it doesn't matter. His actual damages are the fact that he had this super serious deprivation occur to him. Basically, he's the victim of theft. He had this serious deprivation happen to him. That's his harm in of itself. The fact that there was this total dispossession of his personal property, and it was so wrongful and so serious that in of itself is the actual damages. So his loss of possession, even if it was very temporary, in that case will be enough for actual damages. So the shortcut in our heads as we're looking at torts fact patterns is if we see someone stealing property from the plaintiff, we can just say, okay, plaintiff now has actual damages. If we see property wrongfully stolen from the plaintiff, and that plaintiff is totally dispossessed of his personal property by stealing or otherwise wrongful assertion of dominion and control over his property, okay, that's automatically, basically I'm using the word automatically, it's automatically, virtually automatically actual damages. Okay, so that means we've established 3 ways at this point that our plaintiff can have actual damages in the context of trespass to chattels and conversion. Number 1, harms to his personal property. You know, he gets his windshield smashed in. Okay, that's actual damages. Harms to himself, like bodily injury. Okay, he gets his medicine stolen. He can't take it and has an injury as a direct result. That's actual damages. And now we get the idea of dispossession, right? Basically, the plaintiff is totally dispossessed of his personal property by stealing. Okay, that's actual damages. There is a 4th and final way that we can get to actual damages in the context of trespass to chattels and conversion. And this is the loss of use of the personal property for a substantial and measurable period of time. For a substantial period of time in kind of a measurable way. So here we say, depriving the plaintiff the use of his personal property also constitutes actual damages or an interference if the deprivation is substantial and measurable, not momentary. Okay, so in this case, if we see a person that has been deprived of his personal property for an extended period of time, if someone loses their personal property by, some sort of trespass or retaking, basically let's just use an example. If our defendant goes, and let's say this time our defendant isn't acting in bad faith. Let's make it a good faith defendant. So say our defendant basically mistakenly takes property that he thinks belongs to himself, but actually belongs to the plaintiff. So say the defendant and the plaintiff have an identical jacket, right? The defendant and the plaintiff have some identical piece of clothing. Say it's a jacket. And say one day the defendant basically mistakenly grabs the wrong jacket out of the closet because it looks very similar to his friend's jacket, or he looks very similar to his own jacket, but he's actually grabbing his friend's jacket. So in this case, and say he takes the jacket and he wears it and he takes it home and the friend doesn't get his jacket back for several months, okay? And say it's a really expensive, nice jacket, okay? Well, in this scenario, the plaintiff has been deprived the use of his personal property for a significant amount of time. It's not a momentary kind of loss. It's not like the defendant took the jacket for 1 second and was like, oh shoot, this isn't mine, and immediately gave it back. Here we would say because the amount of time that he lost the jacket was kind of extended and significant, that's more measurable. That loss of possession, especially of like an expensive jacket, maybe there was a lot of events that came up, maybe there was networking events or whatever, and our plaintiff really needed this jacket and didn't have access to the jacket. So he's got this loss of possession that is actual damages because it was for an extended period of time, not momentary. That loss of use for a substantial period of time can also constitute actual damages, which can be an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession in personal property. It's very important to note with this idea of loss of use. If the loss of use is very momentary or temporary, it's generally not going to be actual damages. Same fact pattern, if our defendant takes the jacket and he walks away with it in good faith and 30 seconds later realizes as he's walking out the door, oh wait, this isn't my jacket, it's a little bit smaller or whatever, this isn't mine, and puts it back exactly where he left it. There's been no actual change to the jacket. It's being left in the same condition that he found it in. In that case, we would say the plaintiff really doesn't have any actual damages. That type of momentary, temporary interference is not going to amount to any actual damages. There isn't any significant impairment of the value, condition, or quality of the jacket. Our plaintiff didn't lose the use of it for a substantial period of time. He only lost use for like 30 seconds, and there's nothing he could have even used it for in those 30 seconds. So there's no real significant loss of use. There's no damage to the jacket. It's not dispossession. It's not like it was stolen from him, and there's no harm to the plaintiff himself. So in that case, none of our four are really satisfied. In that case, the plaintiff really wouldn't have any actual damages, which means there's no interference with the plaintiff's right of possession, where a jacket mistakenly gets carried away for 30 seconds and instantly gets put back in the same condition. Okay? That is our second element, right? It's important to recognize when we're thinking about this second element and we're trying to determine whether there's been an interference with the plaintiff's right of possession and personal property, what I would do is always ask, does our plaintiff have actual damages? And there's 4 ways in trespass to chattels and conversion where we can see the plaintiff actually have actual compensatory damages. We have dispossession, which is basically something is stolen from him, right? He's been totally dispossessed of his personal property by stealing or other wrongful conduct. Okay, that's number 1. That's actual damages in of itself. Just because of the mere fact that he had this total dispossession by wrongful, serious conduct, okay, that's harm in of itself. That's actual damages. If he's got loss of use for a substantial period of time, that's actual damages. If there's impairment of the value, quality, or condition of his personal property, like his windshield gets smashed in, that's actual damages. If he sustains bodily injury, his medicine gets taken, he has physical injury, that's actual damages. Okay, so 4 ways. Dispossession, loss of use for a substantial period of time, harm to his personal property, or harm to himself, harm to the plaintiff. Those are the 4 ways we can get actual damages for the intentional torts of trespass to chattels and conversion. Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first-year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career, and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.